About the things that linked my two recent films together. And it occurred to me the thing that I was trying for in both cases was to take a very personal story, not my personal story, my subject's personal story, and create a universal understanding about my subject's life and also deliver a message that would have meaning to people that knew nothing about these people and would remember them because their lives lent meaning to your lives. I think that just... It's back on. Okay. First, I'll give you a little background. I am a documentary filmmaker, and in both cases, I directed and produced these films, and I also wrote them. The first film that we're going to talk about is a film called The Loving Story, and that was shown on HBO after it ran in festivals and theatrically around the world. It also was shown on HBO, and I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but HBO is one of the prime networks for documentary films. So it was really an honor to have my very first film shown on HBO. It ended up winning an Emmy Award, it won a Peabody, and it was shortlisted for an Academy Award. So when these films begin to win these awards, it's clear that the message has gotten beyond the individual subject and that people feel it has some meaning that sometimes a very intimate documentary might not have. The second film I made two years later, and that is playing at the Berlinale, and that is called Afternoon of a Faun, Tanaquil Leclerc. Very different subject matter, but has some of the same elements in it. And so what I thought I would do is show you clips from both of these films and then discuss what are those elements that take a personal story and make it universal. To give you a little background on The Loving Story, the Lovings, they were an interracial couple who married in 1958 in Virginia. And in the United States, interracial marriage in 1958 was illegal in 22 states. Years later, they took their case to the Supreme Court, and they overturned all the anti-miscegenation statutes in the country. And I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but that means interracial. So there was a tremendous prejudice in the United States about interracial marriage. It harkens back to the days of slavery. When they were arrested, they were thrown into jail. It was a felony. And the judge decided that either they had to spend a year in the penitentiary or he would banish them from the state of Virginia for 25 years. Banishment is not a legal penalty in the United States, but it also harkens back to the days of slavery. If you did something wrong, when the colonies were being settled in the United States, if you did something wrong, you were banished. So this really had an impact that went far beyond two people that just committed a crime. It was trying to say that this goes back to the history of the United States. I think we should show the first one, and then we can talk about the second one as well. I'm just curious, how many people in this audience are filmmakers or familiar with the way of making movies? Not many, huh? Okay. Well, I'm not going to talk about the technical things about the film, but I am going to talk about certain elements that I think help us go from something very specific to something broader and universal. Does anybody have an idea of what we used in the beginning of this movie to do that? Any thoughts about what in these first few scenes help us understand that this is going to be a much broader message than just the story of these two people? Okay, I'll answer the question. Basically, if you've listened to the music, in the very beginning of the film, we use the second...
Sounds, yeah, I think it's because it's too close from
Okay. We use the second movement of the Dvorak's New World Symphony. That beautiful choral music that you hear in the beginning is a very universal piece of music. Then later in the scene, we start hearing some blues. And that's very specific to where the Lovings lived in Virginia. Some kind of, old-timey bluesy music. And we're hoping that people would get a signal right away that we're talking about something universal. And indeed, their story becomes a very universal story because they ultimately take their case to the Supreme Court of the United States, and it overturns all the interracial laws in the country. And it affects other countries as well, not just the United States. So they become very well known. And today, while the United States and the Supreme Court is wrestling with issues of same-sex marriage, they often invoke the Loving case because there's a similarity. We're talking about not just a civil rights case, but we're talking about a human rights case. So many people, when they're discussing same-sex marriage, they also talk about the Loving story. Does anybody have any questions about that particular clip or that movie? Yes?
Is this all archival footage?
That's a really good question. The black and white footage that you saw was archival footage, and it's 16 millimeter. It was shot in 1965, and I was very lucky as a filmmaker to come across it because talk about going from personal to universal or specific to universal, to be able to be with the Lovings at that time instead of having people just tell us what happened to them, which is what you often see in documentary films. People explain something and then maybe a photograph is used or a reenacted scene is used. This takes you back in time and place. Verite footage specifically, how many of you know what cinema verite is? Okay, so you know that is the kind of shooting where the director's like a fly on the wall. He's not going to interfere with what's going on in the scene, and he's just going to shoot what he sees, and then he'll edit. He will have an effect on it eventually, but it makes you feel like you're right there with the subject. So to be able to have what we call verite footage in a film that was made in 2008 is quite a gift, and it makes you feel like you're with them, right? And so that is one of the things that we had, an opportunity we had to work with, that we could put you back in time and space as if it was time travel. Are there any other questions about the use of verite footage or the film itself, the story? Okay, now the next film that I worked on is a film about Tanika Leclerc, who is a ballet dancer. She was very well known in the early 50s. She was part of the New York City Ballet. She was a muse to George Balanchine, who was probably the greatest choreographer of the 20th century, and also to Jerome Robbins, who was also one of the true greats. He choreographed for theater and for ballet. And they were both in love with her, and they both found her truly inspirational. Well, what's so important about that? One is that she's unique. When you see her on stage, you'll see you've probably never seen anything quite like it. But tragically, Tani was stricken with polio when she was 27 during a tour through Europe. She was paralyzed from the waist down, and she never danced again. So what really makes her story universal is how do we deal with the tragic twist of fate that stops us from being able to do what we thought we were always going to do, that we're passionate about, that we are immensely talented to do, gifted to do, and suddenly we can no longer, of all things, she loses the use of her legs. She had the most beautiful legs, which you will see. And so, again, we had a specific story about a very specific human being, and the challenge was to make people who don't know anything about ballet or even care about ballet care about this person and care about what happens when these things happen. So why don't we show that now? So if you want to see more of that, it's playing at the Berlinale on Saturday night, 10:30. One of the things that I tend to not like in documentaries, at least the ones I work on, is I don't like it when you have an omniscient narrator telling the story for you. Someone we often call the voice of God, who narrates the entire story. I feel it separates the viewer from the subject. So in both of these documentaries, we let the people who are closest to the subjects tell the story. In this documentary, we have 4 different people who are very close to Tani tell her story. In the case of the Lovings, we even had the Lovings voice throughout the film, even though in both of these documentaries, all the subjects have been dead for quite a while. So we were forced to reconstruct their lives through these friends and family and some voiceover recordings that were made of them before we ventured into this story. In the case of the ballet film, we also had Tanny's letters, which became a rich foundation for telling her story, because once she was stricken with polio, we found that she had written many, many letters, mostly to Jerome Robbins, not to George Balanchine, because he was with her. She was in Denmark, and she was in Denmark for 6 months. So most of the letters are back and forth between Jerome Robbins and Tanny Leclerc. And those letters lend this huge personal, intimate feeling about her, very much like the verite footage in The Loving Story, where we feel like we've gone back in time with that verite, that black and white footage in The Loving Story. We feel like we're going back in time with Tanny's letters. So that's always going to be something I'll look for if I'm making a documentary, is how can we get people really close to the subject so you feel like you're learning about them from the inside out as compared from the outside in. No omniscient narrator telling you the story, overseeing the entire event, but the person involved, the subjects, their friends, they're telling you the story so you feel close, which also helps you develop empathy, and that goes towards the universality of the message. If you feel something for the subject, and we certainly hope you do when these movies are over, we find that many people are in tears, which I'm always happy to see. I hand out the Kleenex happily. That means that they have felt something for the subject, and they are going to go back and think about what this means to them. So that's really the gist of my talk. It's the effort to combine the very personal, intimate experience with a much more universal message, because we do feel that the value of the film, the message of the film, is very, very important, and we want you to remember it. I hope there's some questions, because I don't have much more to say about it. If I were able to show more of the film, it would be easy to go into other specifics, but because our time is limited, I could only show small clips.
Thank you for taking questions. So I will have the first one, if you allow.
Please.
Isn't it so that the message had a form? And today, the message comes without any form on the net, without any restriction, without any shaping. And we are talking much more to each other worldwide, but in former times, what was spread at the larger public, it had a shape and a form. And how can we, without making restrictions on what is going to the net, educate people in order that they give their messages a form?
I'm really glad you brought that up, because the one other important element that I did not address is the idea of story. Many documentaries take a thesis and they put the thesis out there and they elaborate on it and they illustrate it with still images, particularly historical docs, with still images, with interviews, with what we call talking heads, experts that come on stage to tell you information. And the form of it is simply an illustration of the thesis. These documentaries don't do that. These documentaries have a story arc. They have an Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. You know how the story begins. In the case of the ballet film, you come to understand how important a dancer she is. It's very important for us to establish very early, so when she does get stricken with polio, you understand what we're going to lose in the culture. The same thing with the Lovings. You need to care about these people. You need to see them together in their home with their children. Okay, so the first act really does establish both of these subjects, and then the second act is very dramatic. What has happened to them? In the case with Tanny, she gets polio. With the Lovings, they get arrested and they're banished and they have to move to Washington, D.C. And then the third act is how they resolve it. And in the Lovings, they take their case to the Supreme Court. And you start to hear from the lawyers. You understand that the two very important lawyers play a role in their lives. In the case of Tanny, she comes to understand what this illness means to her, and she reconciles with it. She doesn't overcome it. She doesn't triumph over polio, but she accepts it. And she understands that she can still have a full life even if she can't dance any longer. So it really is a story with an arc. And there are lots of things that we have to leave out, because if we put every detail in and every piece of information, then we lose that sense of the story, and the impact of what we're trying to do here is diminished. That's my feeling. Now, not every documentary filmmaker feels that way, but that's the way I approached it.
Questions? Yeah, please.
So, hello, my name is Juan and I am from Spain. I would like to ask you two questions. And about the first piece of documentary you showed, the Loving History, I would like to congratulate you because of the little piece we had the chance to see. And I would want to say that I especially like the way it has been edited. And it came to my mind that all the HBO products that I have ever seen, they have always been really, really good edited. I mean, the way you show the pictures, the music, the atmosphere, the everything. Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can
Do you
hear
hear
you.
me?
Go ahead.
I think
Go
it's
ahead.
not necessary, but okay.
Yeah.
And well, I would like to ask you how to watch it, because the preview was not enough, obviously.
I'm glad you feel that way. You can go to HBO Go. It is also on Netflix, and it's on Amazon, and it's now available on DVD and digital download and all of those things. So
Okay.
it's a loving story.
Okay, and also I want to ask you, which thing do you think is the most important one when you are making a documentary? The rhythm, the history, or the narration, or on which point do you focus the most when you want to tell a history?
You know, that's a really good question. It usually takes a while for me to decide what the essence of the story is. And that's maybe a highfalutin way of saying the meaning. What does this mean? Why is this important? And once I come up with that idea, then the rest starts to tell itself. And it's a combination of all the things that you mentioned, the story, the history, all of it. But it all has to go to the essence. In the case with the ballet film, we've already talked about what the essence is, that this is a woman who needed to reconcile herself to living without something that she felt she would always do in her life. So it's an existential question. It's who am I? We all think we're going to do something and then we find we can't. So what does that mean to our identity? Who are we? There's also beautiful poetry in her story, because dance is all about defying gravity. And dancers will always try to defy gravity and then come down to earth. And Tanny comes tragically down to earth prematurely. So once I appreciated that there was a poetry and that there was this broad universal issue about who am I, then the rest of it was easy. I shouldn't say easy, but it kind of unfolded for me in a fairly natural way.
Hello, my name is Natalia, and I'm from Poland. I have a question. Those two documentaries are about the past. So I was quite curious if, did you ever dig into your past and investigate about your own past and your own documentaries that happened in your family back in the past, or whatever, something like that?
When my mother passed away about 5 years ago, I realized that there were a lot of questions that I hadn't answered. There were unresolved issues. And I was angry at myself for not having addressed them more directly when she was alive. And I talked to relatives to find out a little bit more about her, because she was the enigma in my family. The rest of the family was pretty matter of fact, but she was the big mystery. And so I did investigate it, and I wrote a novel. And that helped me deal with the issues. So that's my form of documentary. And the novel veers a little bit away from the real history, but it helped me explore the issues. Just like I was saying, the essence of these stories, it helped me understand the essence.
Thank you.
You're welcome. By the way, this film will also be seen eventually will be on television on American Masters, PBS, and it will be available on DVD. When I say this film, I mean the ballet film. That will be available on DVD and digital download, Netflix, all of those places.
Okay, so my next question is, which one do you think is the perfect length for a documentary? How long should it be? Because in movies, I think it's more or less clear how long it should be, between 90 minutes and 2 hours. But in documentaries, I've always found a diversity between maybe 50 minutes till more than 2 hours. So what do you think about
The
it?
Loving Story is 77 minutes, and the Afternoon of a Fawn is 90 minutes. And I think the story usually tells you how long it has to be. And I think, you know, when a film is too long, that can really dilute the impact. So one has to be very disciplined. As I said, it's very tempting to put a lot of things into a documentary if you have the information, if you have the footage, you have the wonderful images, and you're dying to use them. And you have to force yourself not to. Because if you lose the essence of the story, then it's like just falling away, you know? And it never has the same impact. You know? It's a good discipline.
The audience is tired. I see there's one more.
Hi, I'm Simona, and yeah, okay. No, I was just curious to know where do you find those stories? How do they came to your path?
There's such a thing as we often refer to as a story chill. You see something, you come across it in different ways, and it just hits you, and you get a chill, and you say, how is it that I didn't know about this? How is it that this has never been made into a film? It has to be made into a film. You feel this obligation to do it, and before you know it, you're just swept up in the story. In the case with the Lovings, I read Mildred Loving's obituary in the New York Times, and I had been previously running a documentary film festival in North Carolina that was in the South. It was exclusively documentary. I was sure that if there had been a documentary on the Lovings, I would have seen it. So I knew pretty quickly that it had not been made, and to me that felt wrong. You know, this was not only an important civil rights story and a human rights story, but it was a love story, a beautiful love story. So that just felt like a no-brainer. In the case with Afternoon of a Fawn, I came across the footage of Tanny dancing Afternoon of a Fawn, and I was just swept up in it. I thought she looked so beautiful, and I'd never seen her before. So there was a reason, because she had gone out of the public eye when she was sick. Usually a dancer that has that power, you learn about them as you're growing up, and you hear about them, and even when they stop dancing, their legacy still continues. But in her case, she just went out. She just disappeared. So I was very intrigued. That's how it happens. Thank you. By the way, if any of you are interested in following either one of these films to know what's happening when they're going to show in places like Germany, and we do have Facebook pages, The Loving Story and Afternoon of a Fawn. So it's a good way to keep up with what we're doing.
Do you have any new stories to work on?
I have a documentary that I'm thinking about, but the other stories that I'm most involved in right now are narrative films. And that would take too long probably to explain, but one of them is a wonderful adaptation from a young adult novel called Endangered, and I think it will be part animation and part live action. So stay tuned on my Facebook page, and I'll be talking about it, okay?
Hello, I'm Camilla from Italy.
I was just wondering, since we're at the ICD, and I was just thinking about the themes, and the themes are, the overall theme, and please correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I gathered, is emotions, and those are transcending and borderless. It's a borderless theme, like it's the same everywhere in the world. Do you think that what you're doing is cultural diplomacy? Do you think you can be classified as a cultural diplomat?
I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that if a film doesn't have a strong emotional intelligence, have a strong emotional impact, then it's really losing something, because a film that's just intellectual and just is an idea film or information can be wonderful for people who are interested in that subject matter. But a film that has real emotion will interest anybody. And I truly believe that, I mentioned earlier that I hope that people would develop empathy for both of these subjects. And I hope that happens all over the world. So thank you for saying that.
I think we have to close the debate, and I thank you very much, and thank the audience for having had many questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.